Hello there, and welcome to Before Law, where we venture into the quiet corners of what might have been, and curiosity is allowed to take its time without hurry. Tonight, we're not discussing the familiar rhythms of history as we know them. Instead, we're stepping into something far more unsettling, a scenario that could rewrite everything we understand about human resilience and the fragility of our modern world. Picture this. You wake tomorrow morning, and the news carries reports of unusual weather patterns. Within weeks, temperatures begin their relentless descent. Within months, snow refuses to melt. Within years, our cities become monuments beneath advancing walls of ice. This isn't science fiction or distant geological speculation. This is the terrifying possibility of a sudden ice age, one that arrives not over millennia, but within a single human lifetime, sweeping away everything we've built in a cascade of frost and silence. What would happen if the delicate atmospheric machinery that keeps our planet temperate suddenly ceased? How would 7 billion people respond when the very foundation of civilization, agriculture, begins to fail under an endless winter? And perhaps most haunting of all, what traces of our technological marvel would survive for future archaeologists to puzzle over, buried beneath miles of ice like ancient mysteries waiting to be discovered? Tonight, we'll walk through this frozen nightmare step by step, examining not just the science of how such a catastrophe might unfold, but the human story within it, the desperate migrations, the collapse of nations, the final flickering lights of knowledge as libraries freeze and servers shut down forever. This is the story of our world's end, not in fire, but in ice. The mechanisms that could trigger such a catastrophe are more numerous and fragile than most realize. Our planet's climate system operates like a vast, interconnected machine, with countless moving parts that must function in harmony. When even one component fails dramatically, the entire system can spiral into chaos with frightening speed. Consider the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, a massive conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warm tropical water northward while pulling cold polar water south. This system, often called the Global Ocean Conveyor, is responsible for keeping Europe's climate surprisingly mild for its latitude. London sits at roughly the same latitude as Labrador, yet enjoys temperatures that would make a Canadian winter seem tropical by comparison. But this circulation depends on a delicate balance of temperature and salinity that can be disrupted in catastrophic ways. Recent scientific models suggest this circulation could weaken or collapse entirely if too much fresh water from melting ice sheets dilutes the salt water that drives the current's density differences. Ironically, global warming might paradoxically trigger a localized ice age across the North Atlantic region. The collapse wouldn't happen gradually over centuries. Ocean circulation models indicate such a shutdown could occur within a matter of decades, plunging Western Europe into a climate more akin to northern Canada. But ocean currents represent just one vulnerability in our climate system. Volcanic activity presents another pathway to sudden cooling, one with terrifying historical precedent. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it caused what became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere, leading to famine and social unrest. Snow fell in June across New England, and temperatures dropped so severely that many considered it a sign of approaching apocalypse. Now imagine not one volcanic eruption, but a supervolcanic event, like those that have occurred periodically throughout Earth's history. The Yellowstone caldera, sitting beneath one of America's most beloved national parks, represents exactly this kind of threat. Should it erupt with the force of its past explosions, it would inject billions of tons of ash and gases into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering what volcanologists term a volcanic winter. Temperatures could drop by several degrees Celsius globally, and the cooling effect could persist for years or even decades. The ash cloud from such an eruption wouldn't respect national boundaries. Within days, the northern hemisphere would be shrouded in a grey twilight that could last for months. Photosynthesis would slow to a crawl as plants struggled to capture the diminished sunlight filtering through the ash-laden atmosphere. The growing seasons in temperate regions would effectively disappear, turning vast agricultural areas into frozen wastelands where nothing could grow. Perhaps even more of a cosmic ominous is the possibility trigger. Asteroid impacts have punctuated Earth's history with sudden climate shifts, and while large impacts are rare, they're not impossible. An asteroid just a few kilometers across, striking at the right angle and location, could inject enough debris into the atmosphere to trigger an impact winter lasting years. The dust and particles would reflect sunlight back into space, creating a feedback loop of cooling that could push the planet into a prolonged glacial period. More subtle but equally devastating would be a significant reduction in solar output. Our sun is a variable star, and while its fluctuations are usually minor, historical records suggest periods of dramatically reduced solar activity can trigger severe cooling. The Maunder minimum, a period of reduced sunspot activity from roughly 1645 to 1715, coincided with some of the coldest winters in recorded European history. Rivers that had never frozen solid became highways of ice, and growing seasons shortened so drastically that famine became common across northern latitudes. Should the sun enter a more severe minimum, one lasting decades rather than years, the cumulative effect could push global temperatures below the threshold necessary to sustain our current agricultural systems. The feedback mechanisms would then take over. More ice means more sunlight reflected back to space, which means more cooling, which means more ice. Once this albedo feedback loop begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. The speed at which these changes could unfold challenges our assumptions about climate stability. We tend to think of ice ages as gradual processes, unfolding over thousands of years, as orbital cycles slowly shift the balance of solar energy reaching Earth's surface. But the geological record reveals instances of much more rapid climate shifts. Ice cores from Greenland show evidence of temperature changes of 10 degrees Celsius occurring within decades, sometimes within years. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 13,000 years ago, provides a chilling example of how quickly our planet can shift from warming to freezing. After thousands of years of gradually warming temperatures as the last ice age waned, something triggered a sudden return to near-glacial conditions. This cold snap lasted over 1,000 years, and current evidence suggests the transition from warm to cold may have occurred within a single human lifetime. Some researchers propose that this rapid cooling was triggered by the collapse of ice dams in North America, releasing vast quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic and disrupting ocean circulation patterns. Others point to evidence of extraterrestrial impacts, suggesting that fragments of a disintegrating comet may have struck Earth, triggering massive wildfires and atmospheric changes that plunge the planet back into ice age conditions. The mechanisms are debated, but the speed of the change is undeniable. Within perhaps 50 years, a world that had been steadily warming returned to the grip of glacial cold. Forests retreated, ice sheets advanced, and human populations that had begun to expand and develop more complex societies found themselves once again struggling for survival in a harsh frozen landscape. For modern civilization, such rapid climate shifts would prove catastrophic beyond imagination. Our entire global system depends on climate stability in ways that our ancestors could never have conceived. The intricate web of international trade, the just-in-time delivery systems that keep our cities fed, the energy infrastructure that powers our technology, all of these assume that weather patterns will remain within predictable parameters from year to year. A sudden onset ice age would shatter these assumptions within months. As temperatures plummeted and growing seasons disappeared, agricultural regions that feed billions would become barren. The grain belts of North America, the rice paddies of Asia, the olive groves of the Mediterranean, all would succumb to killing frosts that arrive earlier and last longer each year. The social and economic disruptions would cascade through every aspect of human civilization, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Stock markets would collapse as investors realized that quarterly earnings projections had become meaningless in a world where basic survival was uncertain. Supply chains would snap under the pressure of desperate hoarding and the simple impossibility of transporting goods across frozen landscapes where fuel becomes precious beyond measure. But perhaps most devastating would be the psychological impact on humanity itself. We have built our entire conception of progress on the assumption that tomorrow will be at least as hospitable as today. The sudden realization that nature could so easily sweep away everything we've accomplished would shake the foundations of human confidence in ways we can barely imagine. The story of how our species would respond to such a catastrophe. How governments would fail or adapt. How communities would fracture or unite. How knowledge would be preserved or lost. Forms the heart of this frozen nightmare we're exploring tonight. For while the ice might claim our cities and our crops, the true battle would be fought in the realm of human spirit and ingenuity, where our greatest strengths and deepest failures would be revealed under the harsh light of an endless winter. As the first winter of the new ice age settles across the continents, the transformation begins not with a single dramatic collapse, but with 1,000 small failures, each one seemingly manageable until they converge into something unstoppable. The grocery stores in Minneapolis begin rationing heating oil in October, when temperatures that should hover around 50 degrees Fahrenheit refuse to climb above freezing. By November, when snow should be a possibility, it becomes a certainty that never melts, accumulating day by day into drifts that block doorways and bury cars. The farmers in Iowa watch helplessly as their corn withers under unseasonable deepen through September. What should frosts that arrive in August and have been harvest season becomes a desperate scramble to salvage anything edible from fields that look more like graveyards, the stalks blackened and brittle under skies that seem perpetually grey. The wheat fields of Kansas fare no better, their golden promise turning to ash under the relentless advance of killing cold. In the cities, the first signs manifest as inconveniences that gradually transform into existential threats. Power grids strain under unprecedented demand as millions of heating systems run continuously, struggling against temperatures that drop far below their design specifications. Rolling blackouts become routine, then permanent, as power plants designed for temperate climates begin failing when their cooling systems freeze and their fuel supplies dwindle. The elderly die first, quietly and in large numbers, as heating systems fail and bodies already fragile surrender to the cold, decapacity, and eventually rooms becoming triage centers where doctors must choose who. The frozen ground makes receives the dwindling supplies of bland hospitals, overflow with cases of hypothermia and frostbite, their emergency kits and heating fuel. The morgues fill beyond burial impossible, leaving bodies stacked in refrigerated trucks that no longer need refrigeration. Transportation networks crumble under the weight of endless snow and ice. Highways become impassable corridors between abandoned cities, their surfaces cracked and heaved by freeze-thaw cycles that happen daily rather than seasonally. Airports shut down as dicing equipment proves inadequate for conditions that persist without relief. Railways buckle under thermal stress, their steel rails contracting and expanding until the infrastructure simply tears itself apart. The first mass migrations begin in the northern latitudes, where the cold strikes hardest and earliest. Millions of people from Canada, Northern Europe, and Russia begin leaving behind everything they cannot moving south, carrying what they can. These climate refugees stream populations, the international order that has governed governments struggle to maintain basic services for their own across borders, that quickly become meaningless. ASD human affairs for centuries begins to dissolve as borders against the desperate tide of humanity, nations turn inward, hoarding resources and closing seeking warmth. But the cold follows them south, advancing at a pace that seems slow from day to day, but proves relentless over months and years. Cities that once seemed safely temperate find themselves gripped by Arctic's Thames freezes solid for conditions. London boroughs now a highway of ice that connects cut off from each other by failed transportation the first time in centuries, becoming than the cold itself. Global food reserves, designed to shipments to preserve supplies for their own populations. Rice of agriculture triggers famines that spread faster systems. Paris experiences temperatures that would have been considered impossible under the weak spring sun. The collapse months as crops fail across vast regions simultaneously. The InTard trade unravels as exporting nations halt just years before. Its cafes and boulevards buried under snow that refuses to melt. Even a Cape web of international foo-handled temporary shortages evaporate within ear from global markets as producing regions either freeze or hoard their harvests for local, dependent on this global food system, begin to starve in numbers that dwarf any phi beans from South America, all dissap from Asia, wheat from North America. So survival, urban populations, completely amine in recorded history. Cities that house millions find themselves with no means of feeding their populations as truck deliveries cease and store shelves remain empty. The social contract tray as hungry people compete for dwindling resources that binds urban civilization together begins to and the thin veneer of civility that masks our animal nature starts to crack under the pressure of survival. Governments attempt to maintain order through martial law and rat the scale of the crisis. Military ironing systems. But these measures prove inadequate against units, themselves composed of soldiers with families facing starvation, begin to desert or turn their weapons against the authorities they once served. Police forces dwindle as officers abandon their posts to care for their own loved ones, leaving cities to descend into chaos where only the strongest and most ruthless can secure the resources our modern world begins to fail in cascading waves needed for survival. The digital infrastructure that connects. Data centers, designed to operate optic cables, crack under frost, and cellular become sporadic, then disappear entirely as fiber within narrow temperature ranges, shut down as cooling systems freeze and heating systems prove inadequate. Internet connections towers lose power. The vast repository form starts to van of human knowledge stored in digitalish bit by bit, like a library burning in slow motion. Financial cannot buy food that systems collapse as marketsless in a world where money become meaning doesn't exist or of modern economics crumbles as bank accounts become numbers be transported. Credit cards become fuel that cannot worthless plastic in computers that no longer function, and the entire edifice barter systems emerge to replace currency that has lost all value. Valuable than fair gold and silver briefly retain worth, but even precious metals eventually become lesserwood, blankets, and preserved food. The wealthy, with their resources and private security forces, initially fare better than the general population. Their families are starving, and no. But even wealth proves limited protection against a crisis of this magnitude. Private to relocate to regions that might remain habitable longer conditions. Security forces defect when retreat to bunkers and compounds stocked with supplies, or attempt jets cannot fly in blizzard institutions and universities, the repositories of human knowledge and that simply do not exist. Scientific amount of money disappears and personnel flee. Research can purchase supplies innovation, struggle to maintain operations as funding facilities shut down as they cannot afford heating or electrical power, and decades of scientific progress risk test minds of our species, who might have being lost as equipment freezes and databases entirely on basic survival. Libraries and museums find themselves focused become inaccessible. The Briggs solutions to the crisis, those temples to human achievement and culture, face for refugees. Many begin burning books and artifacts, impossible choices between preserving their collections and providing shelter for fuel, destroying to preserve. The accumulated wisdom of millennia literally goes up in smoke as in hours what took centuries to create in survival over cultural continuity. In rural, desperate people choose warmth over heritage. Immediate sufficiency initially have challenges, as traditional over their urban counterparts. They know how to preserve food, heat homes with wood, areas, those with experience in farming and maintain basic tools without complex supply chains. But even these communities face growing seasons disappear and livestock lack of feed. The perm die from cold anafrost line creeps southward, making agriculture impossible in regions where it had thrived for centuries. As the crisis deepens, humanity begins to split into distinct populations. Those who adapt quickly to the new conditions and develop survival skills begin to form the wood, wind, and solar power when cities, to preserve and ration food with scale energy production, using nucleus of what might become post-apocalyptic societies. They learn to scavenge useful materials from abandon available. These groups often mathematical precision, to maintain small operate with a harsh pragmatism that would have seemed cruel in the old world, but becomes necessary for survival in the new one. Others, unable to adapt to, simply surrender to desperate conditions so different from the world they knew, front the reality that everything air. Mental health crises multiply as people they worked for, everything they understood about how the world operates, has become meaningless overnight. Suicide rates climb as individuals and entire families choose death over the struggle to survive in a world that seems hostile to human existence. The children adapt better than adults to the new reality paradoxically, often. They lack the psychological investment in the old world that makes change so traumatic for their parents. And they learn survival skills with the same flexibility they once applied to video games and social media. These young survivors become the bridge between the world that was and whatever world might emerge from, that the lights have gone out forever. The survivors begin to understand that they are witnessing not just the end of an era, but perhaps the end of the brief, brilliant moment when humanity thought it had conquered nature itself. More severe than the last, the true arrive, each and third winter sashes of civilization, as the second an effort. This is a fundamental shift in the conditions that support human civilization. A return is not a temporary crisis that will resolve itself with time. Scope of the transformation becomes clear. This to a world where survival depends entirely on immediate, have been replaced by the access to food, shelter, and warmth. The complex interdependencies that allowed billions of people to live in comfort. Brutal simplicities of its advance, claiming cities' patience of geological time but the speed of human catastrophe. And in the growing distance existence, the ice continues, and farmlands with the silence of a world where most of the machines have fallen silent, where the hum of progress has been replaced by the whisper of wind through empty streets. The survivors face a truth more profound than mere catastrophe. This is the moment when humanity discovers what remains, when everything we believed permanent proves as fragile as frost on glass. The transformation of human society accelerates through the third and fourth winters, each more severe than anything recorded in historical memory. By now, the Northern Hemisphere resembles a landscape from another planet entirely. Where once stood Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto, there are only frozen monuments to human ambition, their skyscrapers emerging like broken teeth from drifts that reach the 20th floor. The Great Lakes have become a single sheet of ice so thick that the few remaining survivors use them as highways, walking across what were once shipping channels that carried the commerce of nations. In these conditions, the very concept of nations begins to lose meaning. The carefully drawn lines on maps that once defined sovereignty become irrelevant when the primary concern is finding enough firewood to survive another night. The United States government, operating from a series of bunkers and temporary shelters scattered across the southern states, maintains nominal authority over territories it cannot reach and populations it cannot count. Congressional sessions, when they occur at all, focus entirely on resource allocation and triage decisions that would have been unthinkable in the old world. European Union headquarters in Brussels sits abandoned beneath 30 feet of snow, its halls silent except for the occasional crack of freezing pipes and the collapse of snow-heavy roofs. The careful bureaucracy that once regulated everything from agricultural subsidies to internet privacy has been replaced by the harsh mathematics of survival. Local strongmen and improvised councils make decisions based not on legal precedent or democratic, and who dies when resources run short. The global process, but on the simple calculation of who lives communication networks that once knitted the world together have largely collapsed, leaving isolated pockets of survivors to wonder if they are alone. Shortwave radio operators, those hardy souls who maintained the old technologies even as the world went digital, broadcasts paint a picture of a world transform, become the primary means of long-distance communication. They'd, beyond recognition, reports of ice of failed harvests and starving populations, desperate sheets advancing across formerly temperate regions, accounts pleas for information about missing loved ones who vanished in the Great Migrations. Some of these radio voices tell stories that strain credibility, accounts of entire cities disappearing beneath advancing glaciers in a matter of months, of mountain ranges buried so completely that their peaks no longer break the horizon to their limits. It becomes impossible to determine whether these represent accurate observations or the fevered imaginings of isolated minds. Push. Truth and rumour blend together in the crackling static of emergency broadcasts that may be the last words spoken between distant human communities. The preservation of knowledge becomes a race against time and ice. In the few heated shelters that remain operational, small groups of scholars, scientists, and educators work frantically to preserve materials that won't degrade in extreme. They copy medical texts by hand onto essential information in formats that might survive the collapse, willing to learn. These modern scribes understand into stone tablets and teach crucial skills to anyone cold, carve basic scientific principles time when the accumulated wisdom of centuries could be lost forever. If that they are living through a dark age, that once housed millions of books and countless research, it exists only in digital form. Universities face impossible choices, burn their collections to provide wooden furniture for fuel. The great libraries of the world strip copper wiring from walls and burn databases, become salvage operations where desperate survivors warmth for the living or watch both books, and people freeze together in the dark. Many choose a middle path, carefully selecting which texts to preserve and which to sacrifice, making decisions about the future of human knowledge based on immediate survival needs. Medical knowledge proves particularly crucial as the collapse of modern healthcare systems forces communities to rediscover treatments that don't require advanced technology. Doctors who once relied on sophisticated diagnostic equipment learn to identify diseases by symptoms alone, while pharmacies run out of manufactured drugs and herbalists become essential community members. The few remaining hospitals operate more like battlefield medical stations, focused on trauma care and basic life support rather than the complex procedures that characterized modern medicine. Agricultural knowledge becomes equally precious as surviving communities attempt to grow food in conditions that challenge every assumption about farming. The growing seasons in previously fertile regions shrink to mere weeks or disappear entirely, forcing desperate experiments with cold-resistant crops and greenhouse techniques that require minimal external energy. Seed banks, those carefully maintained repositories of genetic diversity, become more valuable than banks that once held gold reserves. The social structures that emerge from this chaos reflect humanity's adaptability in the face of existential threat. Some communities organize themselves around shared skills or common backgrounds, with engineers clustering together to maintain what technology remains functional, while farmers and rural dwellers form groups focused on food production and preservation. Others organize along family or tribal lines, with extended kinship networks providing the trust necessary for cooperation when resources are scarce and every decision carries life or death consequences. These new societies often adopt practices that would have seemed primitive or harsh in the old world, but prove essential for survival in the new one. Resource allocation based on contribution to group survival becomes common, with those unable to work receiving reduced rations. Exile becomes the standard punishment for theft or violence, as communities cannot spare resources to maintain prisons or rehabilitation programs. The democratic ideals that flourished during humanity's brief age of abundance give way to more authoritarian structures that prioritize efficiency and survival over individual rights. Yet even in these harsh conditions, glimpses of human nobility emerge. Teachers who risk their lives to maintain schools in freezing buildings, doctors who work without pay to treat the sick, engineers who freely share knowledge that could mean the difference between a community's survival and extinction. These individuals becoming not just technical knowledge, but the values, the seeds from which a future civilization might grow, preserve, that make human society worth rebuilding. The children born during these years will know no other world than this frozen landscape, and they adapt to it with the remarkable plasticity of youth. They learn to read weather patterns with the skill of ancient mariners, to identify edible plants in environments where vegetation is scarce, to repair and maintain equipment that their elders consider hopelessly complex. These children represent both humanity's greatest hope and its most profound loss. They will survive, but they will inherit that once defined human civilization. As the ice, a world stripped of most of the achievements, continues its relentless advance, pushing the boundaries of habitability ever southward, the survivors begin to understand that this is not a temporary catastrophe that make their change in the conditions from which they will recover, but a fundamental planet hospitable to human life. The warm period that allowed civilization to flourish, that supported cities and agriculture and the complex web of relationships that connected billions of people across the globe, has ended. What remains is a planet returning to the frozen state that has characterized most of its history, a world where human beings must once again learn to live as a minor species, struggling for survival in harsh and unforgiving conditions. The great cities that once housed millions become archaeological sites buried under ice, their steel and concrete monuments to human ambition, preserved in frozen time like insects in amber. Future archaeologists, if any exist, will puzzle over the REM as we puzzle over the artifacts of ancient ants of our digital age, just species capable of such technological civilizations. They will wonder how Arvels could vanish so quickly when the climate shifted, not understanding that our very success made thought we had conquered. In us vulnerable to the natural forces, we, the growing silence of the constant hum of machinery, has been replaced by, of the lights have gone out forever, where most the whisper of wind across ultimate test of human resilience. They must not endless snowfields. The few who remain face the only survive the physical challenges of cold and hunger, but preserve something essential about what it means to be human in conditions that reduce existence to its most basic elements. The Ice Age has returned, not with the gradual advance that characterized previous glacial periods, but with the sudden violence of a system pushed beyond its breaking point. And in its wake, humanity discovers that all our technological marvels, all our confidence nature, were built on foundations far more in progress and mastery over fragile than we ever imagined. Yet even as the ice claims territories that had known warm unexpected begins to emerge from the ruins of the old world, in isolated pockets scattered across the southern for thousands of years, something latitudes, small communities discover food and shelter. It demands a fundamental reimagining of what that survival requires, more than just human society can become when stripped of its technological crutches and force. Survivor enclaves separated by hundreds to confront the raw elements of existence. These, or thousands of miles, of along remarkably similar lines, despite their isolation. Leadership gravitates toward those who combine frozen wasteland, develop practical skills with the ability to make harsh decisions quickly. The comfortable democratic processes of the old world, with their lengthy debates and committee structures, prove inadequate when every choice carries immediate consequences for community survival. Instead, councils of the most experienced survivors emerge, their authority derived not from elections, but from demonstrated competence in keeping people alive. The currency of this new world becomes knowledge itself, but knowledge of a very different kind than what once filled universities and research institutions. Understanding which woods burn longest in makeshift stoves becomes more valuable than advanced mathematics. Knowing how to preserve meat without refrigeration carries more weight than theories of quantum physics. The ability to repair clothing by hand surpasses expertise in computer intellectualism, but rather a programming. This is an in a world where mistakes, brutal sorting of human knowledge based on immediate utility between communities, develops along ancient patterns kill quickly, trade that predate modern commerce by millennia. Caravans of survivors, wrapped in whatever warm clothing they can scavenge, travel for days through frozen landscapes to exchange goods that cannot be produced measure, as does metal that locally. Salt becomes precious beyond can be worked into tools and weapons. Books printed on actual paper gain value not just for their content, but as. The great libraries of the world become kindling that burns cleanly and consistently mines, where desperate people extract fuel for survival. Each volume a choice between warmth for one night or preservation of knowledge for an uncertain future. Medical practice reverts to methods, but with the crucial advantage of modern understanding that would have been familiar to practitioners centuries ago, and using honey as an antiseptic when applied through primitive means. Doctors trained in the latest surgical techniques find themselves brewing willow bark tea to treat pain pharmaceutical supplies run out. The few remaining hospitals become teaching centers where medical knowledge is transferred through direct apprenticeship, with students learning to dye and equipment fails. Surgical procedures that once required team sews conditions by touch and observation alone, when diagnostic of specialists and sophisticated equipment are simplified to what ateable in the old world become death sentences, can be accomplished with basic tools and minimal anesthesia. Many conditions that would have been tree but others prove surprisingly manageable with careful attention and patience. The practice of medicine becomes more art than science, relying on accumulated wisdom and careful observation rather than laboratory tests and computer analysis. Education transforms into something our ancestors would recognize immediately: the direct transfer of survival skills from one generation to the next. Children learn to read, not from books, but from the patterns of smoke that indicate whether a fire is burning efficiently. They study mathematics through the practical application of rationing food supplies and calculating heating fuel requirements. Science becomes the ability to predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations and understanding which materials conduct heat most effectively for insulation. Storytelling emerges as one of the most important cultural activities, serving multiple functions beyond mere entertainment. Stories preserve practical knowledge in memorable forms, encoding information about seasonal patterns, dangerous weather signs, and effective survival techniques. They also maintain psychological connections to the world that was, helping survivors process grief and loss while building shared identity within communities. Around fires that must be carefully rationed, voices carry tales that blend memory with myth, creating new cultural narratives for a transformed world. Religion and spirituality take on forms that would seem familiar to earlier human societies, but strange to the secular world of the late industrial age. When death becomes a daily presence and survival depends on factors largely beyond human control, communities develop belief systems that help explain suffering and provide meaning in the face of overwhelming loss. These aren't necessarily organized religions in the traditional sense, but rather spiritual frameworks that help people endure conditions that challenge the very foundations of human optimism. Some communities develop fatalistic philosophies that view the Ice Age as a natural correction, a return to conditions more typical of Earth's history after humanity's brief period of climatic luck. Others embrace apocalyptic beliefs that interpret the crisis as divine judgment, requiring moral reformation and spiritual purification for any hope of eventual recovery. Still, others adopt pragmatic spiritualities focused on honoring those who have died while maintaining determination to preserve what remains of human culture and knowledge. The psychology of survival itself becomes a crucial factor in determining which communities endure and which dissolve into chaos. Groups prove more resilient than that maintain some sense of purpose, beyond mere existence that preserve rituals, celebrations, and cultural those focused solely on day-to-day survival. Communities' practices, even in simplified forms, show better mental health outcomes and lower rates of suicide and violence. The human need for meaning and connection proves as essential as physical warmth, and adequate born during these years develops psychological nutrition. Children, rather than aberrations, displaying remarkable adaptability, but frameworks entirely different from those of previous generations. They accept scarcity and danger as normal conditions, also a hardness that would have seemed concerning in the old world. These children, often remaining largely ignorant of the complex social and technological, show advanced skills in practical areas, while systems that once connected global civilization. The question communities face the biological challenges of small population groups of genetic diversity becomes increasingly important as isolate. Medical knowledge about the dangers of inbreeding becomes crucial practical information, forcing communities to make on genetic rather than romantic considerations. Difficult decisions about marriage and reproduction ensure genetic health across generations, while others attempt. Some communities develop complex kinship tracking systems to genetic bottlenecks. Communication between far to maintain contact with distant groups, specifically to prevent flung communities, relies increasingly on methods that would have been familiar to previous centuries. Message systems using smoke signals, mirror flashes, and even trained animals emerge where radio equipment fails or fuel becomes unavailable. These communication networks, fragile and limited though they are, become lifelines that prevent communities from sliding into complete isolation and the psychological deterioration that accompanies it. The few remaining functioning radio operators become figures of almost mythical importance, their ability to reach across vast distances, making them invaluable sources of information and psychological connection to the broader world. Their broadcasts, crackling through static and atmospheric interference, carry news that reports of other survivors. Warnings about advancing ice sheets spreads through communities like ripples in still water, and occasionally, miraculous accounts of AI about recovery or return to previous conditions. This reaching isolated groups. As the fourth is about adaptation to a fundamentally different planet, winter deepens into the fifth. The survivors begin to understand that this is no longer one where the brief warm period that allowed human civilization to flourish has ended, perhaps permanently. The ice sheets continue their advance, and weather patterns suggest hoped might be as severe, but that what they initially temporary crisis has become the new normal for Earth's climate system. The few meteorologists and climate scientists still able to access weather data paint a grim picture. Atmospheric conditions have shifted into a pattern that could persist for decades or centuries. The mechanisms that once moderated Earth's temperature have been disrobed impossible without massive external intervention that knocked it so severely that recovery no longer exists. This isn't a temporary ice age that will end with changing orbital cycles, but a climate shift that could define human existence for generations to come. In this realization lies both despair and liberation. Once communities accept that the old world is truly gone, they can focus entirely on building something new, rather than trying to preserve something that no longer exists. The most successful survivor groups begin developing long-term strategies based on the assumption that current conditions will persist indefinitely, planning not for recovery, but for adaptation to a permanently frozen world. The seeds of whatever civilization might emerge from this catastrophe are being planted in the careful preservation of essential knowledge, the development of sustainable survival practices, and the formation of social bonds strong enough to endure extreme hardship. Whether these seeds will grow into something reckoned anything in our history remains invisibly human, or evolve into forms of society, unlike open question. One that will be answered by those who continue itself has become precious as gold. To draw breath in a world where breath. As settlements begin to consolidate around the most defensible sources of heat and shelter, a new geography emerges from the ruins of the old world. The survivors gravitate toward locations that offer multiple advantages: proximity to forests for fuel, access to flowing water that hasn't frozen completely, and natural windbreaks that provide some protection from the relentless storms. These sites often bear no resemblance to the population centers of the previous era. Phoenix, once a sprawling metropolis in the American Southwest, lies buried beneath sand and ice, while a cluster of survivors might thrive in a previously unknown valley in the Appalachian Mountains, where geothermal springs provide just enough warmth to sustain life. The transition from emergency survival to something resembling permanent settlement marks a crucial phase in humanity's adaptation. Communities that successfully make this transition begin to develop the infrastructure necessary for long-term existence in frozen conditions. They dig deep root cellars that take advantage of the Earth's geothermal warmth, construct workshops where essential tools can be manufactured and repaired, and establish systems for collecting and storing the precious resources that mean the difference between life and death. These settlements rarely exceed a few hundred individuals, as larger populations become impossible to sustain with available resources. The careful balance between having enough people to handle essential tasks and not so many that resources become overstretched defines the optimal community size. Each settlement becomes a small nation unto itself, developing its own customs, leadership structures, and solutions to the unique challenges posed by their particular environment and circumstances. The division of labor within these communities reflects both practical necessity and the gradual emergence of new social hierarchies. Those with medical knowledge, mechanical skills, or the ability to organize complex tasks naturally assume leadership roles. Food production specialists become as revered as doctors, while individuals skilled in crafting clothing or maintaining heating systems enjoy status that would have been unimaginable in the old world. The social mobility that characterized industrial society gives way to more rigid structures competence. Women based on essential skills and demonstrate often find their roles dramatically altered by the new conditions. Physical strength, while important, becomes less significant than skills in food preservation, textile production, and medical care. Communities discover that survival depends as much on the ability to mend clothing, treat illness, and maintain group morale as it does on hunting or heavy labor. The gender dynamics of the old world, already changing before the crisis, undergo radical transformation as traditional roles prove inadequate to the demands of survival. The elderly occupy a particularly complex position in these new societies. While their physical limitations make them a drain on scarce resources, their knowledge and memory of pre-crisis skills often prove invaluable. They remember techniques for preserving food, traditional remedies for common ailments, and methods of construction and repair that younger people never learned. Communities that successfully integrate their elderly members while managing the resource burden they represent tend to develop more sophisticated survival strategies than those that abandon them. Children born after the crisis begins to constitute a distinct generation with fundamentally different assumptions about the world. They learn to walk on ice before they learn to walk on clear ground, understand the sounds that indicate a properly functioning fire before they learn to read, and develop an intuitive sense for weather patterns that adults struggle to acquire. They also exhibit behaviors that would have seemed to display remarkable resilience and adaptability, but through conscious effort. These children often being in the old world, a casual acceptance of death, a practical approach to resource allocation that can seem heartless, and a lack of interest in activities or knowledge that don't contribute directly to survival. The preservation of literacy becomes a contentious issue within many communities. Paper is valuable as kindling, and the time required to teach reading and writing competes with more immediately practical skills. Some communities make the conscious decision to maintain literacy at all costs, viewing it as essential to preserving human culture and enabling future recovery. Others adopt a more pragmatic approach, focusing on oral traditions and hands-on learning while allowing written knowledge to fade away. The debate over education reflects deeper questions about what aspects of human civilization are worth preserving when preservation itself requires significant sacrifice. Technology within these communities represents a fascinating blend of scavenged modern equipment and rediscovered traditional techniques. Solar panels salvaged from abandoned buildings provide electricity for essential tasks, but only when the sun penetrates the often overcast skies and when snow can be cleared from their surfaces. Wind generators constructed from scavenged materials supplement power generation, though they require constant maintenance in harsh conditions. Most communities rely primarily on mechanical devices that can be manufactured and repaired with basic tools. Hand-cranked grain mills, simple looms for textile production, and forge systems for metalworking. The relationship between these scattered settlements evolves slowly, hampered by the extreme difficulty of long-distance travel and communication. Trade networks develop along routes that remain passable during certain seasons, with goods and information flowing between communities that might have miles of frozen wilderness. These trade relationships, often be separated by hundreds, determine which settlements thrive and which gradually decline as access to essential resources they cannot produce locally makes the difference between growth and stagnation. Conflicts between settlements, while not unknown, tend to be limited by the simple reality that warfare consumes resources that communities can. Are disputes over territory, particularly access to forests, natural resources that multiple communities might claim, mineral deposits, or other ill afford to waste, more common. These conflicts are often resolved through negotiation. Rather, enemy is the environment itself rather than other human survivors. The development of new than violence, as both sides recognize that the real religious and philosophical frameworks accelerates as communities seek meaning in their transformed existence. Some embrace beliefs that interpret the Ice Age as a necessary purification, a cleansing that will eventually give way to renewal and rebirth. Others adopt more fatalistic worldviews that emphasize acceptance of harsh conditions and finding purpose in simple survival. Still others maintain faith that human ingenuity will eventually find solutions to restore the climate, viewing their current struggle as temporary despite mounting evidence to the contrary. These belief systems often incorporate practical survival wisdom into their spiritual teachings. Religious observances might center around the changing of seasons, the careful maintenance of fires, or communal activities that strengthen social bonds while accomplishing necessary work. The sacred and the practical merge in ways that would have seemed primitive to the old world, but prove psychologically essential for maintaining hope and purpose in desperate circumstances. Art and culture, while severely constrained by resource limitations, persist in forms adapted to the new conditions. Music becomes particularly important as it requires no materials beyond simple instruments crafted from available materials. Songs serve multiple functions, preserving important the human voice, and perhaps information in memorable forms, providing emotional release during difficult times, and maintaining cultural identity within communities. Visual arts often take the form of decorative elements added to practical objects, as communities cannot spare materials for purely aesthetic purposes. The gradual recognition that current conditions might persist indefinitely forces communities to begin planning for futures they might not live to see. This long-term thinking represents a crucial psychological shift from crisis response to permanent adaptation. Communities begin investing resources in projects that will benefit future generations. The careful cultivation of hardy food plants, the construction of more permanent structures, and the training of young people in skills that will be needed decades in the future. Genetic diversity becomes an increasingly urgent concern as isolated populations face the biological challenges of small breeding groups. Some communities develop complex systems for arranging marriages and reproduction to maintain genetic health, while others establish connections with distant settlements specifically to prevent inbreeding. The romantic ideals of the Old World give way to more practical considerations about the genetic health of future generations, as communities recognize that biological survival depends on careful management of their human resources. Medical practice continues to evolve as practitioners adapt modern knowledge to primitive conditions. Surgical techniques are simplified to what can be accomplished with basic tools and minimal anesthesia, while pharmaceutical knowledge shifts toward identifying and preparing natural remedies from available plants and minerals. The few remaining medical professionals become teachers as much as practitioners, passing on essential knowledge to apprentices who will carry medical skills into the future. The question of what knowledge to preserve becomes increasingly urgent as the Old World begins to age in as the generation that remembered die. Communities face difficult choices about which aspects of human learning to maintain and which to let fade away. Mathematical and scientific principles that have no immediate practical application compete with technical skills that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The great libraries of human knowledge, once stored in digital formats, must be recreated in forms that can survive without electricity or sophisticated storage systems. Might generously be called spring, though, as the fifth winter gives way to what temperatures remain well below the freezing point for most of the Northern Hemisphere. The survivors begin to understand that they are no longer preserving civilization, but creating something entirely new. The institutions, technologies, and social structures that once defined human society have been swept away as thoroughly as if they had never existed. What remains is not a reduced version of the Old World, but the foundation upon which an entirely different form of human society must be built. The ice continues its advance, claiming territories that had remained habitable through the early years of the crisis. Weather patterns suggest that the atmospheric conditions driving the cooling are not only persistent, but may be intensifying. The few remaining meteorologists, working with primitive instruments and limited data, can offer no hope of near-term recovery. The brief warm period that allowed human civilization to flourish appears to be ending, replaced by climatic conditions that may persist for centuries or millennia. In accepting this reality, the surviving communities face their greatest challenge yet: the need to preserve something essentially human while adapting to conditions that push the boundaries of what human life can endure. They must maintain enough of their cultural heritage to remain recognizably human while to their ancestors. The balance changing so fundamentally that they can thrive in a world that would be alien between preservation and adaptation will determine not only whether humanity survives the new ice age, but what form that survival might take. The scattered settlements represent humanity's best hope for continuity, each one a small flame of consciousness flickering against the gathering darkness. Whether these flames will eventually grow into something resembling civilization or gradually fade into the endless winter remains the great unanswered question of this frozen age. The survivors cannot know whether they are witnessing the end of human achievements or the difficult birth of something unprecedented in human experience. What emerges from these scattered embers of humanity is something that would both fascinate and horrify observers from the Old World. The settlements that survive into the 6th and 7th years develop characteristics that blur the line between civilization and tribalism, between progress and regression. They are neither the sophisticated societies that once spanned continents, nor the primitive bands that characterized early human development, but some thingic change. The most successful entirely new, forged in the crucible of catastrophe communities, discover that survival requires a delicate balance between cooperation and ruthless pragmatism. Resource allocation becomes a science unto itself, with community leaders developing complex systems for distributing food, fuel, and shelter based on contribution, need, and long-term community survival. These systems would seem harsh by the standards of the old world, where abundance allowed for charitable impulses and support for those unable to contribute. In the new reality, every calorie consumed and every piece of firewood burned must be justified by its contribution to the group's continued existence. Leadership structures evolve to meet challenges that no previous human society has faced on such a scale. Traditional democratic processes prove too slow and resource-intensive for communities where decisions must be made quickly and implemented without debate. Instead, councils emerge composed of individuals with demonstrated expertise in essential survival skills. These leaders make decisions based not on popular opinion or legal precedent, but on harsh calculations of what will keep the most people alive through the next winter. The transformation of human relationships under extreme stress reveals both the best and worst aspects of human nature. Communities that successfully navigate the crisis often develop bonds of mutual dependence that run deeper than family ties, with individuals willing to sacrifice personal comfort and even safety for the good of the group. Yet these same communities may make collective decisions to abandon elderly or disabled members who cannot contribute to survival efforts, choices that would have been unthinkable in the old world but become grimly necessary in the new one. Language itself begins to evolve rapidly within isolated communities as new vocabularies develop to describe conditions and experiences that have no precedent in human history. Words emerge for different types of dangerous ice, for the subtle variations in smoke that indicate fuel efficiency, for the complex emotional states that arise from prolonged exposure to existential threat. These linguistic adaptations represent more than mere vocabulary changes. They reflect fundamental shifts in how humans perceive and categorize their world. The role of violence in these new societies presents complex moral challenges. Communities must balance the need to defend their resources and territory against the reality that conflict consumes precious energy and materials that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Many conflict resolution that prioritize settlements develop sophisticated systems of eyes negotiation and resource sharing over confrontation, not from moral conviction, but from practical necessity. Violence, when it occurs, tends to be swift and decisive, as prolonged conflicts become luxuries that struggling communities cannot afford. Trade between settlements, when it occurs at all, follows patterns that would seem alien to economists from the old world. Currency has no meaning when the only valuable items are those that directly contribute to survival. Instead, complex barter systems emerge based on the exchange of essential goods and services. A community with access to metal ore might trade raw materials for manufactured tools, while settlements with medical expertise offer healing services in exchange for food or fuel. These trade relationships often determine which communities thrive and which gradually fade away as isolation takes its toll. The preservation of technical knowledge becomes a race against time as the generation that remembers the old world begins to age and die. Communities face agonizing choices about which skills and information to preserve and which to let fade away. Advanced mathematics and theoretical physics compete with practical knowledge of metalworking and food preservation for the limited time and resources available for education. Many communities develop informal apprenticeship systems where essential skills are passed directly from master to student, ensuring that crucial knowledge survives even if the broader context that once gave it meaning is lost. Children born into these conditions represent both humanity's greatest hope and its most profound transformation. They adapt to circumstances that would have seemed nightmarish to previous generations, with a resilience that amazes and sometimes disturbs their elders. These children learn to read weather patterns before they learn to read books, understand the mechanics of fire before they grasp abstract concepts, and develop social skills optimized for small, tightly knit communities rather than the complex, diverse societies of the Old World. They are simultaneously more capable and more limited than their predecessors, shaped by conditions that demand practical competence while offering little opportunity for intellectual or cultural exploration. The question of what constitutes education in these new circumstances becomes increasingly urgent as communities recognize that their children will inherit a world bearing little resemblance to anything in previous human experience. Some settlements maintain rudimentary schools focused on basic literacy and mathematical skills, viewing these as essential foundations for whatever civilization might eventually emerge. Others adopt a more pragmatic approach, emphasizing hands-on learning of survival skills while allowing abstract knowledge to fade away. The debate reflects deeper questions about human identity. What must be preserved to remain recognizably human, and what can be sacrificed in the name of survival? Medical practice undergoes its own radical transformation as practitioners learn to work within severe resource constraints while dealing with health challenges unique to the new conditions. Frostbite, hypothermia, and malnutrition become routine concerns, while diseases related to poor sanitation and overcrowding in heated shelters create new epidemiological challenges. The few remaining medical professionals become teachers as much as healers, training apprentices in techniques that blend modern understanding with primitive methods. Surgical procedures are simplified to what can be accomplished with basic tools, while pharmaceutical knowledge shifts toward identifying and preparing natural remedies from whatever plants remain accessible. Religious and philosophical frameworks continue to evolve as communities seek meaning in circumstances that challenge fundamental assumptions about human purpose and divine providence. Some settlements embrace belief systems that interpret the Ice Age as a test or purification, maintaining faith that eventual recovery is possible through proper spiritual practices and moral behavior. Others adopt more fatalistic worldviews that emphasize acceptance of harsh conditions and finding purpose in simple survival and community maintenance. Still others develop entirely new spiritual frameworks that incorporate the unique challenges and experiences of the frozen world into their understanding of human existence. The arts, while severely constrained by resource limitations, persist in forms adapted to the new realities. Music becomes particularly important as it requires minimal materials while serving crucial psychological functions. Songs preserve important information in memorable forms, provide emotional release during difficult times, and maintain cultural identity within communities. Stories told around carefully rationed fires blend memory of the old world with emerging myths about the new one, creating narrative frameworks that help communities process their transformation while maintaining connections to their human heritage. Architecture and construction techniques evolve rapidly as communities learn to build structures capable of withstanding conditions that would have challenged the most advanced engineering of the old world. Traditional construction materials become unavailable or impractical, forcing builders to develop innovative techniques using salvaged materials and local resources. Insulation becomes an art form, with communities experimenting with everything from animal hides to carefully arranged snow barriers to maintain livable temperatures in their shelters. These architectural innovations represent genuine advances in cold weather construction, knowledge that might prove valuable for centuries to come. The relationship between human settlements and the natural environment takes on characteristics that would have seemed primitive to the old world, but represents sophisticated adaptations to new conditions. Communities learn to read subtle environmental cues that indicate changing weather patterns, locate resources, and identify potential threats. They develop symbiotic relationships with the few animal species that remain active in the frozen landscape, learning to hunt without depleting populations, and to use every part of their prey to minimize waste. This intimate connection with the natural world represents both a return to earlier human patterns and an evolution towards something entirely new. As the Ice Age enters its second decade, the generation that remembers the old world begins to pass away, leaving behind communities that increasingly define themselves by their present circumstances rather than their historical origins. The stories told around fires focus less on memories of electric lights and global communications, and more on the immediate challenges of survival and the gradual development of new traditions and customs. This transition represents a crucial psychological shift from a crisis mentality to permanent adaptation, from preserving the old to building something new. The few remaining connections between distant settlements reveal a world transformed beyond recognition. Radio operators, when they can maintain their equipment and find fuel for generators, exchange information about weather patterns, resource discoveries, and population movements across vast frozen landscapes. These communications paint a picture of a planet where human habitation has contracted to scattered points of warmth and light in an otherwise hostile environment. The great cities and transportation networks that once connected global civilization exist now only as archaeological sites buried beneath advancing ice sheets. The biological challenges facing these isolated populations become increasingly apparent as genetic diversity decreases and the health effects of limited diets and extreme conditions accumulate. Communities must balance the need to maintain genetic health through careful reproductive planning with the social and emotional needs of their members. Some settlements establish complex kinship tracking systems to prevent inbreeding, while others attempt to maintain contact with distant communities specifically for genetic exchange. These concerns, once the domain of academic geneticists, become practical matters of community survival. Weather patterns during the second decade suggest that atmospheric conditions have stabilized in configurations that could persist indefinitely. The mechanisms that once moderated Earth's climate have been disrupted so severely that recovery may be impossible without massive external intervention that no longer exists. This realization forces communities to shift from hoping for eventual recovery to planning for permanent adaptation to a frozen world. Long-term projects that seemed impossible during the crisis phase become essential investments in humanity's future. The development of cold-resistant food sources, the construction of permanent settlements designed for extreme conditions, and the establishment of sustainable systems for maintaining essential technologies. The scattered settlements represent different experiments in human adaptation, each developing unique solutions to the challenges of survival in a frozen world. Some focus on technological preservation, maintaining whatever electronic equipment they can while developing new techniques for manufacturing essential components. Others emphasize biological adaptation, selecting for traits that enhance survival in cold conditions while preserving genetic diversity through careful breeding programs. Still others concentrate on cultural preservation, maintaining libraries and schools while developing new artistic and intellectual traditions adapted to their circumstances. These different approaches to survival create a diversity of human communities that, despite their small size and isolation, represent genuine experiments in alternative forms of human society. Whether any of these experiments will prove successful enough to sustain human civilization through the Ice Age remains an open question. The survivors cannot know whether they are witnessing the end of human achievement or participating in the difficult birth of new forms of human society better adapted to the realities of a frozen planet. The transformation of humanity continues to accelerate as communities that successfully navigate the immediate challenges of survival begin to face the longer-term questions of what human society can become under conditions that have no precedent in recorded history. They must preserve enough of their cultural heritage to remain recognizably human while adapting so fundamentally that they can thrive in a world their ancestors would find utterly alien. The balance between preservation and adaptation will determine not only whether humanity survives the new Ice Age, but what form that survival might take. In the growing silence of a world where the hum of industry has been replaced by the whisper of wind across endless snowfields, where the lights of cities have given way to the flickering flames of carefully tended fires, The survivors face questions that challenge the very foundations of human identity. They must decide what aspects of human civilization are worth preserving when preservation itself requires sacrifice. What knowledge must be maintained when resources are desperately scarce, and what forms of society can emerge from the ruins of everything they once knew. The Ice Age has returned with a violence and speed that transforms not just the landscape, but the very nature of human existence. In its wake, humanity discovers that all their technological marvels, all their confidence in progress and mastery over nature, were built on foundations far more fragile than anyone imagined. Yet in the scattered communities that persist against overwhelming odds, something new is emerging from the frozen ruins of the old world, something that may prove more resilient than the civilization it replaces, forged as it is in the crucible of humanity's greatest test. The question of what knowledge survives becomes the defining challenge of the third decade, as communities face the sobering reality that they are no longer temporary refugees waiting for rescue, but the architects of whatever human future might emerge from the frozen wasteland. Libraries that once housed millions of volumes have become memory exercises, their contents preserved only in the minds of those who remember reading them before the lights went out forever. Universities exist now as small circles of survivors gathered around fires, passing down fragments of human understanding through oral tradition and hand-copied notes written on whatever paper can be spared from more immediate needs. The transformation of human knowledge follows patterns that would have seemed impossible during the height of technological civilization. Advanced theoretical physics disappears first, not because it lacks value, but because its applications require infrastructure that no longer exists. Complex mathematical concepts survive only when they prove useful for practical calculations. Determining fuel consumption rates, calculating food distribution, or planning construction projects that must withstand extreme conditions. The elegant equations that once described the fundamental forces of the universe fade from human memory, while basic arithmetic becomes a treasured skill that communities compete to attract and retain. Medical knowledge undergoes perhaps the most crucial transformation, as practitioners learn to blend modern understanding with techniques that require no advanced equipment or pharmaceutical supplies. The few remaining doctors become living encyclopedias of human anatomy and disease, teaching apprentices to diagnose conditions through observation and touch alone. They rediscover the healing properties of plants that grow in the altered ecosystem, learning through dangerous trial and error which natural remedies can substitute for medications that no longer exist. The art of surgery simplifies to procedures that can be performed with basic tools and improvised anesthesia, while complex operations that once saved lives become impossible luxuries that communities cannot afford. Engineering knowledge proves both essential and frustrating, as communities struggle to maintain and adapt technologies designed for a world that no longer exists. Solar panels become precious artifacts that communities fight to protect and maintain, but their effectiveness diminishes as atmospheric conditions reduce available sunlight and harsh weather damages delicate components. Wind generators constructed from salvaged materials provide essential power, but they require constant maintenance and repair, using techniques that must be developed through experimentation rather than consulting manuals that exist only in electronic formats no longer accessible. The preservation of written knowledge becomes a community priority that competes directly with immediate survival needs. Paper burns cleanly and provides excellent kindling for fires that mean the difference between life and death on the coldest nights. Each page saved from the flames represents a conscious choice to preserve information at the cost of warmth, a calculation that becomes increasingly difficult as fuel supplies dwindle. Communities develop their own systems for deciding which texts deserve preservation. Medical manuals, technical agricultural guides, and basic references take priority over literature, history, and abstract philosophy. Yet even as practical knowledge takes precedence, communities discover that cultural preservation serves essential psychological functions that cannot be ignored. Stories, songs, and artistic traditions provide the emotional framework that allows people to maintain their humanity under conditions that reduce existence to its most basic elements. Children who have never known electric lights or heated buildings still respond to fairy tales, still create games and songs that echo the creative impulses that have defined human culture throughout history. These cultural activities consume time and energy that could be devoted to survival tasks, but communities that abandon them entirely often experience higher rates of suicide and mental illness that ultimately threaten their continued existence. The role of education transforms completely as communities recognize that children born into the frozen world will need skills that no previous generation has ever required. Traditional academic subjects give way to intensive training in practical abilities, identifying edible plants in altered ecosystems, reading weather patterns that predict dangerous storms, maintaining fires efficiently to conserve precious fuel, and recognizing the signs of hypothermia and other cold-related medical conditions. These children become remarkably competent in their specialized environment, but they also represent a fundamental discontinuity with previous human experience, as their knowledge and skills prepare them for a world that would be alien to their grandparents. Language itself evolves rapidly within isolated communities, developing specialized vocabularies to describe conditions and experiences that have no precedent in human history. New words emerge for different types of dangerous ice formations, for the subtle variations in wind patterns that indicate approaching storms, for the complex social dynamics that arise when small groups of people must depend completely on each other for survival. These linguistic innovations represent more than mere vocabulary expansion. They reflect fundamental changes in how humans perceive and categorize their world, as communities develop conceptual frameworks adapted to their transformed circumstances. The question of literacy becomes increasingly contentious as communities debate whether the resources required to maintain reading and writing skills justify their continued existence. Paper and writing materials become precious commodities that must compete with more immediately essential supplies, while the time required to teach and practice literacy competes with training in skills that contribute directly to survival. Some communities make the conscious decision to maintain literacy at all costs, viewing it as essential to preserving human culture and enabling future recovery. Others adopt a more pragmatic approach, allowing written knowledge to fade while focusing on oral traditions and hands-on learning that require no materials beyond human memory and demonstration. The few communities that successfully maintain libraries face unique challenges in preserving written knowledge under conditions that threaten both the physical integrity of books and the human capacity to understand their contents. Freezing temperatures make paper brittle and ink fade, while humidity from heating systems causes mold and decay that can destroy entire collections in months. More subtly, the context necessary to understand many texts disappears as the world they describe ceases to exist. Technical manuals become incomprehensible when the machines they describe are no longer available, while historical and literary works lose relevance as communities focus entirely on immediate survival concerns. Scientific knowledge faces particular challenges as the experimental methods that once advanced human understanding become impossible to maintain. Laboratory equipment requires power, controlled temperatures, and specialized materials that no longer exist, while the collaborative networks that once connected researchers across the globe have been severed by the collapse of communication systems. The few remaining scientists work in isolation, unable to verify their observations or share their findings with peers who might build upon their work. Scientific progress, which once seemed inevitable and accelerating, grinds to a halt as communities focus on applying existing knowledge rather than developing new understanding. Agricultural knowledge becomes simultaneously more crucial and more challenging to apply as communities attempt to grow food in conditions that challenge every assumption about farming. The growing seasons in previously fertile regions shrink to brief periods or disappear entirely, while soil chemistry changes as organic matter decomposes slowly in frozen conditions. Traditional crop varieties prove unsuitable for the altered climate, forcing desperate experiments with coal that may not exist, resistant varieties, or may require growing techniques that must be developed through dangerous trial and error. Seed banks, those carefully maintained repositories of genetic diversity, become more valuable than monetary banks ever were, but they also face threats from freezing temperatures, moisture, and simple human error that could eliminate decades of careful preservation work. The relationship between human communities and the natural environment takes on characteristics that represent both a return to earlier patterns and an evolution towards something entirely new. Communities develop intimate knowledge of their local ecosystems, learning to read subtle environmental cues that indicate changing weather patterns, locate scarce resources, and identify potential threats. They establish complex active in the frozen landscape, learning to relationships with the few animal species that remain, hunt, sustain every part of their prey to minimize wastability while using. This intimate connection with the natural world requires knowledge and skills that were becoming rare even before the crisis, as urbanized populations had lost touch with the natural systems that ultimately support all human life. Weather prediction becomes a crucial survival skill as communities learn to recognize the atmospheric conditions that precede dangerous storms or temporary warming periods that might allow for essential outdoor work. The sophisticated meteorological systems that once provided accurate forecasts no longer function, forcing communities to redevelop the observational skills that allowed previous generations to predict weather patterns through direct observation of cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior. These traditional forecasting methods prove surprisingly accurate within limited geographical areas, but they require years of careful observation and experience to develop and apply effectively. The manufacture and repair of essential tools becomes a critical community function as existing equipment wears out and replacement parts become unavailable. Blacksmithing and metalworking experience a renaissance as communities rediscover techniques for working metal using simple forges and basic tools. However, these traditional crafts must be adapted to work with salvaged materials rather than purpose-made raw materials, requiring innovation and experimentation that often ends in failure. The few individuals who possess these skills become invaluable community resources, their knowledge often meaning the difference between a community's continued survival and gradual decline as essential tools break down and cannot be replaced. Textile production faces similar challenges as communities struggle to maintain adequate clothing and bedding, using materials and techniques that have largely disappeared from human knowledge. The synthetic fabrics that dominated the old world proved difficult to repair and impossible to manufacture without industrial infrastructure, while natural fibers must be processed using techniques that few people remember. Wool processing, leatherworking, and fiber spinning become essential skills that communities must redevelop through experimentation and the scattered knowledge of elderly members who may remember these crafts from their childhood or cultural background. The social structures that emerge to manage the preservation and transmission of essential knowledge reflect both the practical requirements of survival and the psychological needs of communities under extreme stress. Formal apprenticeship systems develop as communities recognize that crucial skills must be passed from experienced practitioners to younger members who will carry them into the future. These relationships often take on characteristics that blend professional training with family-like bonds, as master craftspeople assume responsibility not only for teaching technical skills, but also for the personal development and psychological well-being of their apprentices. Decision-making processes within communities evolve to balance the need for quick, decisive action during emergencies, with the requirement for careful deliberation when making choices that will affect the community's long-term survival. Traditional democratic procedures prove too slow and resource-intensive for many situations, while purely authoritarian structures often fail to utilize the diverse knowledge and skills that different community members possess. Most successful communities develop hybrid systems that combine rapid emergency response capabilities with more deliberative processes for long-term planning and resource allocation. The question of what constitutes essential knowledge becomes increasingly urgent as the generation that remembers the old world begins to age and die. Communities face agonizing choices about which information and skills to prioritize for preservation when time, energy, and resources are severely limited. Advanced academic subjects compete with practical survival skills for educational resources, while cultural knowledge must justify its existence against more immediately useful technical information. These decisions shape not only the immediate survival prospects of individual communities, but also the long-term trajectory of human development, as certain types of knowledge disappear forever, while others become the foundation for whatever civilization might eventually emerge. The gradual recognition that current conditions may persist for decades or centuries forces communities to shift their focus from preserving the old world to building something new. This psychological transition proves as challenging as the physical adaptations required for survival, as it requires accepting that the comfortable assumptions and familiar institutions that once defined human civilization may never return. Communities that successfully make this transition often develop stronger cohesion and more sustainable practices than those that continue to hope for a return to previous conditions. But the process of acceptance requires mourning for everything that has been lost, while simultaneously committing to an uncertain future. The scattered communities that survive into the third decade represent different experiments in human adaptation, each developing unique approaches to the challenges of preserving knowledge and culture, while adapting to conditions that have no precedent in recorded history. Some focus on maintaining as much scientific and technical knowledge as possible, viewing themselves as caretakers of human achievement who must preserve civilization's accomplishments until conditions allow for their restoration. Others emphasize practical skills and immediate survival, allowing abstract knowledge to fade while developing new capabilities, specifically adapted to their transformed environment. The diversity of approaches to knowledge preservation creates a situation where different communities may evolve in dramatically different directions, potentially leading to the emergence of distinct human societies with fundamentally different capabilities and worldviews. Communities that successfully maintain literacy and scientific understanding may eventually develop technologies adapted to frozen conditions, while those that focus on practical skills and oral traditions may evolve social structures and cultural practices better suited to long-term survival under harsh conditions. Whether these different approaches will eventually converge into a unified human culture or continue to diverge into separate evolutionary paths remains one of the great unknowns facing humanity in its frozen future. The preservation of human knowledge in all its forms becomes not just a practical necessity for survival, but a moral obligation to the future, a way of ensuring that something recognizably human persists, even as the conditions of human existence change beyond recognition. In the scattered communities that maintain schools around their fires, in the apprentice workshops where traditional crafts are rediscovered and adapted, in the careful copying of essential texts onto whatever materials can be spared, the survivors engage in an act of faith that transcends immediate survival concerns. They preserve knowledge not because they know it will be needed, but because they believe that human understanding itself has value worth protecting, even in the darkest of circumstances. The transformation of human knowledge represents perhaps the most profound change brought about by the Ice Age, more fundamental even than the physical alterations to the landscape or the collapse of political and economic systems. What survives of human learning will determine not only whether future generations can rebuild some version of technological civilization, but also what forms that rebuilding might take. The choices made by scattered communities of survivors about which knowledge to preserve and which to abandon will echo through centuries, shaping the development of whatever human societies emerge from the frozen ruins of the old world. As the ice continues its relentless advance, and the survivors settle into patterns of existence adapted to permanent winter, the question of knowledge preservation becomes inseparable from larger questions about human identity and purpose. What makes a human society recognizably human when stripped of all the technological and cultural achievements that once defined civilization? How much can human knowledge and culture adapt to new conditions before it becomes something entirely different from what previous generations would recognize as their legacy? These philosophical questions have no easy answers, but they will be answered by the daily choices of communities that must balance preservation with adaptation, memory with innovation, in their struggle to maintain something essentially human in a world that has become fundamentally inhospitable to human life as it was once lived. The question of what constitutes human identity becomes increasingly urgent as communities enter their fourth decade under ice, where children born after the collapse now outnumber those who remember electric lights and heated buildings. These young survivors represent both humanity's greatest adaptation and its most profound transformation, shaped by conditions that would have seemed nightmarish to previous generations, but which they accept as the natural order of existence. They possess intuitive skills that amaze their elders, reading ice formations like ancient mariners read stars, understanding fire management with the precision of master craftsmen. Yet they also display a pragmatic acceptance of death and scarcity that would have seemed disturbing in the world that came before. Language within these isolated communities continues its rapid evolution, developing not just new vocabularies but entirely different conceptual frameworks for understanding existence. Words that once defined human experience, progress, vacation, career, retirement, become meaningless artifacts from a vanished world, while new concepts emerge that have no equivalent in previous human languages. The distinction between summer and winter disappears, replaced by subtle gradations of cold that require dozens of specific terms to describe accurately. Social relationships develop new categories that blend family bonds with survival partnerships in ways that previous kinship systems never contemplated. The communities that survive this long begin to exhibit characteristics that blur the boundaries between human society and something entirely new. Reproduction becomes a carefully managed community resource, with decisions about who bears children based on genetic diversity, resource availability, and the community's long-term survival prospects, rather than personal desire or romantic attachment. Child rearing transforms into a collective responsibility where individual parents have less influence than community elders who determine education and training based on projected survival needs rather than personal aptitude or interest. Social hierarchies crystallize around competencies that would have seemed primitive to the old world, but prove essential for survival in the new one. The ability to predict weather patterns through atmospheric observation carries more social weight than advanced degrees once did. Skill in preserving food through traditional methods commands more respect than expertise in financial analysis or software development ever could. Communities develop complex status systems based on practical contributions to group survival, where social mobility depends entirely on demonstrating useful capabilities rather than inherited wealth or educational credentials. The relationship between individual autonomy and collective survival creates tensions that previous human societies never faced on such a scale. Privacy becomes a luxury that communities cannot afford when every action affects group survival, while personal preferences must yield to collective decisions about resource allocation and task assignment. Individual rights, the foundation of democratic societies, prove incompatible with the harsh calculations required for group survival under extreme conditions. Communities that successfully navigate these tensions often develop social contracts that would seem authoritarian by previous standards, but prove psychologically acceptable to members who understand their necessity for continued existence. Religious and philosophical frameworks continue their evolution as communities grapple with questions that challenge fundamental assumptions about human purpose and divine providence. Traditional faiths struggle to explain why a benevolent deity would allow such comprehensive destruction of human civilization, while secular achievement in the face of natural forces beyond meaninglessness of human worldviews must confront the apparent control or comprehension. New belief systems emerge that incorporate the unique challenges and experiences of the frozen world, often blending practical survival wisdom with spiritual practices that help communities maintain psychological cohesion under extreme stress. Some communities develop fatalistic philosophies that view the Ice Age as a natural correction, a return to conditions more typical of Earth's history after humanity's brief period of climatic luck. These groups often embrace austere lifestyles that minimize resource consumption while maximizing spiritual discipline, finding meaning in the simple act of endurance itself rather than hopes for eventual recovery or expansion. Others maintain optimistic beliefs that interpret current hardships as temporary tests that will eventually yield to renewal and restoration, though these communities must constantly adapt their timelines for recovery as years pass without any sign of climatic improvement. The few communities that successfully maintain some form of scientific inquiry face unique challenges in conducting research under conditions that make controlled experimentation nearly impossible. Laboratory work becomes field observation conducted in harsh environments with improvised equipment, while theoretical development proceeds through mental exercises rather than mathematical calculations that require materials for recording complex equations. Scientific progress, when it occurs at all, focuses on immediate practical applications rather than abstract understanding, as communities cannot spare resources for research that might not yield survival benefits. Medical practice continues its evolution toward techniques that require minimal modern understanding with methods external resources. Practitioners develop sophisticated diagnostic skills based on observation and touch, learning to recognize conditions that would have required advanced testing equipment to identify in the old world. Treatment protocols simplify to what can be accomplished with natural remedies and basic surgical techniques, while preventive care focuses on maintaining community health through sanitation practices and nutritional management rather than pharmaceutical interventions that no longer exist. The question of genetic diversity becomes increasingly critical as isolated populations face the biological challenges of small breeding groups over multiple generations. Communities must balance the maintenance of genetic health with social and emotional needs of their members, often developing complex systems for tracking kinship relationships and managing reproductive decisions. Some settlements establish connections with distant communities specifically for genetic exchange, while others implement careful breeding programs designed to maintain genetic diversity within their limited population base. The transformation of human reproduction extends beyond genetic considerations to encompass fundamental changes in how communities view childhood, family structure, and individual development. Children born under these conditions often display physical and psychological adaptations that distinguish enhanced Coldham from previous generations, including tolerance, improved low-light vision, and social behaviors optimized for small group dynamics rather than large-scale social interaction. These adaptations raise questions about the direction of human evolution and whether the species itself is changing in response to radically altered environmental pressures. Education systems that emerge from these conditions bear little resemblance to anything from the old world, focusing entirely on practical skills needed for survival while incorporating cultural knowledge only when it serves immediate community needs. Children learn to read by studying weather patterns and animal tracks rather than books, develop mathematical skills through resource management and construction projects rather than abstract exercises, and acquire social knowledge through direct participation in community decision-making rather than theoretical instruction about democratic principles or individual rights. The arts survive in forms so adapted to current conditions that they would be barely recognizable to previous generations, yet they serve essential functions that communities cannot ignore without risking psychological deterioration. Music becomes primarily functional, with songs that encode important survival information, coordinate group work activities, and maintain emotional connections between community members during the isolation of winter months. Visual arts focus on decorative elements that can be incorporated into practical objects, while storytelling evolves to preserve essential knowledge in memorable narrative forms rather than entertainment for its own sake. Architecture and construction techniques continue their evolution as communities develop building methods specifically adapted to permanent winter conditions. Traditional materials become unavailable or impractical, forcing innovative approaches that utilize salvage components and local resources in ways that maximize insulation and structural integrity while minimizing resource consumption. These architectural innovations often represent genuine advances in cold weather construction that communities that develop might prove valuable for centuries. Even them do not survive to pass if the them on. The relationship between human settlements and the natural environment deepens as communities develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of their local ecosystems. Survival depends on intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and plant cycles that operate according to principles very different from those that governed the pre-crisis world. Communities learn to work with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them, developing sustainable practices that can persist indefinitely, rather than extractive approaches that might provide short-term benefits at the cost of long-term viability. Trade relationships between distant settlements, when they develop at all, follow patterns that prioritize essential goods and genetic exchange over economic profit or interaction cultural. The extreme difficulty and danger of long-distance travel that trade means occurs only when communities possess resources that others desperately need and cannot obtain locally. These relationships often determine which settlements thrive and which gradually decline, as access to diverse resources and genetic material proves crucial for long-term sustainability. The psychological challenges facing communities that survive into their fourth decade under ice include not only the immediate living conditions, but also the profound stresses of harshential questions raised by permanent adaptation to a transformed world. Community members must process the loss of everything they once considered normal, while simultaneously building new cultural frameworks that provide meaning and purpose under conditions that challenge basic assumptions about human existence. Mental health becomes a community concern that requires careful management through social support systems, meaningful work assignments, and cultural practices that maintain psychological resilience. Conflict resolution within communities takes on characteristics that blend traditional human social practices with innovations necessary for survival under extreme conditions. Disputes must be resolved quickly and decisively, as prolonged conflicts consume resources and emotional energy that communities cannot spare. Many settlements develop sophisticated mediation systems that emphasize restoration of community harmony over punishment or individual rights, recognizing that social cohesion represents a survival necessity that transcends personal grievances or abstract principles of justice. The question of leadership succession becomes increasingly important as the original survivors who established communities begin to age and die, leaving behind societies that must transfer authority and knowledge to generations with no experience of the old world. These transitions often prove challenging, as leadership skills effective for crisis management may not translate to term governance the long required for permanent adaptation. Communities that successfully navigate these transitions often develop institutional structures that preserve essential knowledge and decision-making processes while adapting to changing circumstances and personnel. The scattered settlements that persist into the fifth decade represent the emergence of genuinely new forms of human society, adapted to conditions that have no precedent in recorded history. These communities have moved beyond mere survival to develop sustainable cultures that could theoretically persist indefinitely under current conditions. They represent different experiments in human adaptation, each exploring unique approaches to the fundamental questions of how human beings can maintain their essential humanity while adapting to circumstances that challenge every assumption about what human life can or should be. The diversity of solutions developed by different communities creates a situation where human society begins to fragment into distinct variations, each adapted to specific local conditions and philosophical approaches to survival. Some communities emphasize technological preservation and development, viewing themselves as caretakers of human achievement who must maintain civilization's capabilities until conditions allow for expansion and recovery. Others focus on biological and cultural adaptation, developing new social forms and survival strategies that accept permanent change while preserving essential human values and relationships. The long-term trajectory of human development under these conditions remains fundamentally uncertain, as the isolated communities cannot know whether they represent the seeds of future civilization or simply the final phase of humanity's gradual extinction success. Their determined not or failure will be only by their ability to survive physical challenges, but also by their capacity to maintain something recognizably human while adapting to conditions that push the boundaries of what human life can endure. The balance between preservation and adaptation continues to define every aspect of their existence, from daily survival decisions to long-term planning for generations they may never see. The ice continues its patient advance, claiming territories that remained habitable through the early decades of crisis, while weather patterns suggest that atmospheric conditions have stabilized in configurations that show no signs of natural reversal. The survivors face the reality that they are no longer preserving civilization, but creating something entirely new, forged in the crucible of humanity's greatest challenge. What emerges from their struggle will determine not only whether human consciousness persists on Earth, but what forms that persistence might take in a world that has fundamentally rejected the conditions under which human civilization once flourished. In the growing silence of endless winter, where the sounds of human industry have been replaced by the whisper of wind across frozen landscapes, the question of human survival transforms into something far more profound than mere biological persistence. The communities that endure represent humanity's attempt to discover what remains essential about human existence when everything once considered permanent proves as fragile as ice crystals on glass. Their struggle continues not because they know they will succeed, but because the alternative, the simple surrender to extinction, proves incompatible with something deep within human nature that refuses to accept defeat, even when victory seems impossible to define or achieve. As the fifth decade dawns under perpetual winter, something unexpected begins to emerge from the scattered enclaves of human survival. Not hope, perhaps, but something more profound. Evolution. The children who have known only ice and shadow, who learned to walk on frozen ground before they knew the concept of spring, begin to display capabilities that set them apart from any previous generation in human history. Their eyes, adapted to the pale light that filters through endless cloud cover, can discern details in near darkness that would leave their grandparents blind. Their bodies, shaped by constant cold, maintain core temperatures that would have required medical intervention in the old world. These young survivors represent more than adaptation. They embody transformation. Their social instincts operate on frequencies that previous generations struggled to understand, optimized for small group dynamics, where every member's survival depends entirely on perfect cooperation. They communicate through subtle cues that would have been invisible to urban dwellers of the previous century, reading emotional states and physical conditions with an accuracy that seems almost supernatural to their elders. Their play, when resources permit such luxuries, consists of games that prepare them for scenarios their predecessors could never have imagined. Competitions in fire-building efficiency, contests to identify edible materials in barren landscapes, elaborate role-playing exercises that simulate community crisis management. The language these children speak, while recognizably derived from their parents' tongues, incorporates concepts and distinctions that reflect their transformed world. They possess dozens of words for different types of ice formation, each describing specific hazards or opportunities that could mean the difference between life and death. Their emotional vocabulary includes terms for psychological states that arise only under conditions of extreme interdependence, feelings that have no equivalent in languages developed during humanity's brief age of individual autonomy. When they speak of the future, they use grammatical structures that assume cyclical rather than progressive time, reflecting a worldview where change occurs in patterns rather than linear advancement. The communities that successfully integrate these transformed children while maintaining connections to human heritage begin to develop characteristics that blur the line between preservation and innovation. They create educational systems that honor the practical wisdom of the young while preserving the cultural memory of the old, finding ways to bridge the gap between generations whose life experiences differ so radically that they might as well have evolved on different planets. These intergenerational communities often prove more resilient than groups dominated by either the old or the young, as they combine institutional memory with adaptive capability in ways that neither generation could achieve alone. Religious and philosophical frameworks within these communities undergo their most radical transformations. Yet, as belief systems must account for the emergence of human capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. Some communities interpret these changes as divine gifts, adaptations provided by benevolent forces to help humanity survive its greatest trial. Others view them as natural evolutionary responses that demonstrate the species' remarkable plasticity when faced with existential challenges. Still others adopt more cautious perspectives, wondering whether these adaptations represent genuine improvements or losses of essential human characteristics that cannot be recovered once abandoned. The question of what constitutes normal human development becomes impossible to answer as communities watch children grow into adults whose capabilities and limitations differ dramatically from anything in previous human experience. These young adults can survive exposure to cold that would kill their grandparents within hours, but they also display social behaviors that seem rigid and inflexible compared to the individualistic cultures of the old world. They excel at cooperative tasks that require perfect coordination between multiple participants, yet they struggle with concepts of personal privacy and individual achievement that once formed the foundation of human motivation and social organization. Medical practitioners working with these transformed populations face diagnostic challenges that require completely new approaches to understanding human health and development. Physical conditions that would have indicated serious illness in previous generations prove to be normal adaptations to extreme environmental conditions. Psychological patterns that might have suggested disorders in the old world represent functional responses to social environments, where individual survival depends entirely on group cohesion. The few remaining medical professionals must essentially redevelop their entire understanding of human biology and psychology based on observation of populations whose development has followed trajectories that have no precedent in medical literature. The preservation of knowledge takes on new dimensions as communities recognize that their transformed children may be capable of learning and retaining information in ways that differ fundamentally from previous human patterns. Some young survivors display remarkable abilities to memorize complex technical information through brief exposure, while others show intuitive understanding of mechanical principles that their elders struggle to grasp, even through extensive instruction. These cognitive differences create both opportunities and challenges for communities attempting to preserve essential knowledge, as traditional educational methods may prove inadequate for minds that process information according to different patterns and priorities. Trade relationships between distant settlements begin to incorporate exchanges that would have seemed bizarre to previous generations, as communities discover that their populations have developed different adaptive specializations. Some settlements produce individuals with enhanced abilities to navigate in low-light conditions, making them valuable as scouts and messengers during the extended darkness of winter months. Others develop populations with improved cold tolerance, allowing them to perform essential outdoor work under conditions that would incapacitate members of other communities. These human specializations create new forms of interdependence between settlements, as communities trade not just goods, but genetic diversity and specialized capabilities. The architecture and construction techniques that emerge during this period reflect not only adaptation to extreme environmental conditions, but also accommodation to the changing physical and social needs of transformed human populations. Buildings designed for these communities often incorporate features that would have seemed unnecessary or strange to previous generations. Space is optimized for group activities rather than individual privacy, heating systems that account for improved cold tolerance, and social areas designed to facilitate the complex cooperative behaviors that have become essential for community survival. Agricultural practices, where they exist at all, must account for both the drastically altered environmental conditions and the changing nutritional needs of populations whose metabolisms have adapted to extreme conditions. The few communities that successfully maintain food production often discover that their members require different nutritional balances than their ancestors, with some showing improved ability to extract nutrients from foods that would have been considered inadequate by previous standards. These metabolic changes create both opportunities and challenges, as communities must learn to work with biological systems that operate according to principles different from those documented in agricultural and nutritional texts from the Old World. The social structures that emerge to govern these transformed communities often incorporate decision-making processes that reflect the enhanced cooperative abilities of their members, while maintaining enough flexibility to accommodate the institutional memory of older generations. Leadership roles evolve to emphasize coordination and facilitation rather than individual authority, as communities discover that their most effective decisions emerge from collective processes that utilize the enhanced social capabilities of their younger members, while incorporating the wisdom and experience of their elders. Conflict resolution within these communities takes on characteristics that reflect both the practical necessities of survival and the enhanced social capabilities of populations adapted to extreme interdependence. Disputes that might have required formal legal processes in the Old World are often resolved through sophisticated mediation techniques that emphasize restoration of community harmony over punishment or individual vindication. These communities develop remarkably effective methods for maintaining social cohesion while managing the inevitable tensions that arise when groups of people must depend completely on each other for survival. The relationship between individual identity and community membership undergoes profound transformation as populations adapt to conditions where personal survival depends entirely on group success. The individualistic values that characterize much of the Old World prove not only impractical, but psychologically harmful under conditions where personal autonomy must yield to collective decision-making about resource allocation and survival priorities. Yet these communities must also preserve enough individual diversity to maintain genetic health and creative problem-solving capabilities that prove essential for long-term survival. Cultural expressions within these communities evolve to serve functions that blend entertainment, education, and social bonding in ways that reflect both the practical constraints of survival and the enhanced social capabilities of their members. Music becomes particularly sophisticated as communities discover that their members can achieve levels of coordination and harmony that would have been difficult for previous generations, creating complex vocal arrangements that serve both aesthetic and functional purposes. Storytelling incorporates intricate narrative structures that preserve essential information while providing emotional support and cultural continuity across generations whose life experiences differ dramatically. The question of technological development under these conditions creates fascinating paradoxes, as communities must balance the preservation of existing knowledge with the development of new capabilities adapted to their transformed circumstances. Some settlements focus on maintaining whatever advanced technologies they can, viewing themselves as caretakers of human achievement who must preserve civilization's capabilities until conditions allow for expansion and recovery. Others embrace more radical approaches, developing new technologies based on the enhanced human capabilities of their members, rather than attempting to recreate the industrial infrastructure of the old world. The few communities that successfully maintain some form of scientific inquiry begin to develop research programs that focus on understanding the adaptations occurring within their own populations as much as the environmental conditions surrounding them. These investigations, conducted with primitive equipment under harsh conditions, begin to document changes in human biology and psychology that have no precedent in scientific literature. The findings, when they can be recorded and preserved, suggest that human populations under extreme environmental pressure may be capable of adaptive changes that occur far more rapidly than previously understood evolutionary processes would predict. The psychological challenges facing these communities include not only the immediate stresses of survival under extreme conditions, but also the profound questions raised by witnessing human nature itself undergo transformation. Community members must process the reality that their children may represent genuinely different forms of human existence while maintaining cultural frameworks that preserve essential connections to human heritage and identity. This psychological adaptation proves as challenging as the physical adaptations required for biological survival, requiring new forms of counseling and mental health support that address existential questions that no previous generation has faced. The diversity of adaptive strategies developed by different communities creates a situation where human society begins to fragment into distinct variations, each exploring different approaches to the fundamental question of what human life can become under conditions that challenge every assumption about human nature and potential. Some communities emphasize biological adaptation, encouraging the development of enhanced physical capabilities while maintaining cultural practices that preserve connections to human heritage. Others focus on technological adaptation, using enhanced human capabilities to develop new forms of technology, rather than attempting to recreate the industrial infrastructure of the old world. The long-term implications of these adaptive changes remain fundamentally uncertain, as the communities cannot know whether they represent temporary responses to extreme conditions or permanent evolutionary shifts that will define human development for millennia to come. The isolation between settlements means that different populations may be evolving along divergent paths, potentially leading to the emergence of distinct human subspecies adapted to different environmental conditions and survival strategies. Whether these evolutionary experiments will eventually converge into a unified human future or continue to diverge into separate developmental trajectories represents one of the most profound questions facing the species. The relationship between preservation and transformation continues to define every aspect of life within these communities, as they must maintain enough connection to human heritage to remain recognizably human while adapting so fundamentally that they can thrive under conditions that would have been lethal to their ancestors. This balance proves particularly challenging when working with children whose capabilities and limitations differ so dramatically from previous generations that traditional approaches to education, socialization, and cultural transmission must be completely reconsidered. The communities that survive into their 6th decade represent the emergence of genuinely new forms of human society, adapted not only to extreme environmental conditions, but also to the enhanced capabilities and altered needs of populations that have undergone rapid evolutionary change. These societies develop cultural practices, social structures, and technological approaches that have no precedent in human history, yet they must also preserve essential elements of human heritage to maintain connections to the cultural achievements and moral frameworks that define human civilization. As the ice continues its patient advance and weather patterns suggest that current conditions may persist indefinitely, These transformed communities face the reality that they are not preserving the old world, but creating something entirely new. Their success or failure will be determined not only by their ability to survive physical challenges, but also by their capacity to maintain something recognizably human, while embracing changes that push the boundaries of what human existence can encompass. The balance between preservation and adaptation continues to evolve as communities discover new capabilities within their members, while struggling to maintain the cultural and moral frameworks that connect them to their human heritage. The scattered settlements that persist represent humanity's most ambitious experiment in adaptation, each exploring different approaches to the question of what human life can become when everything once considered permanent proves subject to fundamental change. Their struggle continues not because they can guarantee success, but because something within human nature refuses to accept extinction, even when survival requires transformation so radical that it challenges the very definition of what it means to be human. In the growing silence of endless winter, these communities carry forward the essential spark of human consciousness, while discovering what forms that consciousness might take in a world that has fundamentally rejected the conditions under which human civilization once flourished. The transformation that unfolds across the 7th and 8th decades reveals something that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Human beings learning not merely to survive in conditions that once would have meant certain death, but to thrive in ways that suggest entirely new possibilities for what human existence might become. The communities that persist through these extended winters develop characteristics that transcend simple adaptation, moving into territories of human potential that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself under extreme duress. Within these settlements, time begins to operate according to rhythms that bear no resemblance to the calendars and clocks that once governed human activity. The concept of years becomes meaningless when seasons no longer change, replaced by subtler cycles based on variations in ice thickness, patterns of aurora activity, and the migration routes of the few animal species that continue to navigate the frozen landscape. Children born into this temporal framework develop cognitive patterns that process duration and sequence in ways their grandparents find almost incomprehensible, thinking in terms of overlapping cycles rather than linear progression. The enhancement of human sensory capabilities reaches levels that strain the boundaries of what previous medical science considered possible. Adults who have lived their entire mature lives under these conditions develop hearing so acute they can distinguish between different types of ice formation by the sounds they make when subjected to temperature variations. Their sense of touch becomes sophisticated enough to detect minute changes in air pressure that indicate approaching weather systems hours before they become visible. These sensory adaptations prove essential for survival, but they also create perceptual experiences that have no equivalent in previous human consciousness. Communities begin to develop what can only be described as collective decision-making processes that operate below the threshold of conscious deliberation. Groups of survivors working together on complex tasks often coordinate their actions with a precision that suggests some form of shared awareness, anticipating each other's needs and responses with an accuracy that would seem telepathic to observers from the old world. Scientists among the survivors, when they can spare time from immediate survival concerns, struggle to understand whether these phenomena represent enhanced social cooperation or genuinely new forms of human consciousness emerging under extreme environmental pressure. The children who have never known any world but this frozen one begin to display cognitive abilities that challenge every assumption about human intellectual development. Their capacity for spatial reasoning in three-dimensional environments exceeds anything documented in psychological literature. As they navigate complex ice formations and underground shelter systems with an intuitive understanding that their elders must acquire through careful study and practice. Their mathematical thinking often operates through pattern recognition rather than formal calculation, allowing them to solve practical problems with remarkable efficiency while struggling with abstract concepts that form the foundation of traditional education. Language development within these communities accelerates beyond anything seen in previous human societies, not through the addition of vocabulary, but through the emergence of entirely new grammatical structures that reflect their transformed relationship with time, space, and social organization. These linguistic innovations often prove difficult for older community members to learn, creating communication barriers between generations that must be bridged through patient translation and cultural interpretation. The few linguists who survive to observe these changes document phenomena that suggest human language capacity may be far more plastic and responsive to environmental pressures than previously understood. The social structures that emerge to govern these transformed communities often incorporate decision-making processes that would have seemed mystical to previous generations, but prove remarkably effective for managing resources and coordinating activities under extreme conditions. Leadership roles evolve beyond individual authority toward forms of collective guidance that utilize the enhanced cooperative abilities of community members while preserving institutional memory from older generations. These systems often achieve levels of efficiency and fairness that surpass the democratic institutions of the old world, though they operate according to principles that would be difficult to implement in larger or less cohesive populations. Medical practice within these communities undergoes its most radical transformation as practitioners learn to work with human populations whose biological processes have adapted in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about health and disease. Conditions that would have indicated serious illness in previous generations prove to be normal variations in populations adapted to extreme environmental stress. Healing processes accelerate beyond anything documented in medical literature, while resistance to certain types of injury and infection reaches levels that would have required pharmaceutical intervention in the old world. The few communities that maintain any form of technological development begin to create innovations that utilize the enhanced human capabilities of their members rather than attempting to recreate the industrial infrastructure of the previous century. Tools and machines designed for these populations often incorporate features that would have been impossible to use effectively without the enhanced sensory and cognitive abilities that have emerged under extreme conditions. These technologies represent genuine advances in human-machine interfaces, though they remain accessible only to populations that have undergone the adaptive changes necessary to utilize them effectively. Agricultural practices, where they exist at all, must accommodate both the drastically altered environmental conditions and the changing nutritional needs of populations whose metabolisms have adapted to circumstances that would have been lethal to their ancestors. Some communities discover that their members can extract adequate nutrition from food sources that would have been considered inadequate by previous standards, while others develop enhanced abilities to process and utilize nutrients under conditions of extreme scarcity. These metabolic changes create opportunities for sustainable food production in environments that would have been considered completely uninhabitable by traditional agricultural science. The relationship between individual consciousness and community identity undergoes transformations that challenge philosophical assumptions about the nature of personal autonomy and collective responsibility. Members of these communities often report subjective experiences that suggest their sense of individual identity operates within frameworks that encompass group consciousness to degrees that would have seemed pathological by the standards of individualistic societies. Yet these psychological adaptations prove essential for maintaining the levels of cooperation and coordination necessary for survival under extreme conditions. Cultural expressions within these communities evolve to serve functions that transcend entertainment or artistic achievement, becoming integral components of the psychological and social infrastructure that maintains community cohesion across generations, whose life experiences differ so dramatically that they might represent different stages of human evolution. Music, storytelling, and visual arts incorporate elements that utilize the enhanced sensory and cognitive capabilities of community members, while preserving connections to cultural traditions that provide continuity with human heritage. The preservation of knowledge takes on characteristics that blend traditional educational methods with innovations that accommodate the altered learning capabilities of populations adapted to extreme conditions. Some community members display remarkable abilities to acquire and retain complex information through methods that bypass traditional instruction entirely, while others show enhanced capacities for integrating practical and theoretical knowledge in ways that accelerate problem-solving and innovation. These educational adaptations create both opportunities and challenges for communities attempting to preserve essential human knowledge, while accommodating cognitive changes that may represent permanent evolutionary developments. Trade relationships between distant settlements begin to incorporate exchanges that reflect the specialized adaptations that different communities have developed in response to their particular environmental challenges and survival strategies. Some settlements produce individuals with enhanced abilities to navigate in extreme cold, while others develop populations with improved capabilities for maintaining technological systems under harsh conditions. These human specializations create new forms of interdependence between communities, as settlements discover that their long-term survival may depend not only on their own adaptive success, but also on maintaining connections with other populations that have developed complementary capabilities. The question of genetic diversity becomes increasingly complex, as communities must balance the maintenance of biological health with the reality that their populations are undergoing rapid evolutionary changes that may represent adaptations to conditions that will persist indefinitely. Some settlements develop sophisticated systems for managing reproduction to preserve genetic diversity while encouraging the development of beneficial adaptations, while others focus on maintaining connections with distant communities to prevent the isolation that could lead to genetic bottlenecks or the loss of adaptive flexibility. Conflict resolution within these communities incorporates methods that utilize the enhanced social capabilities of their members, while maintaining enough flexibility to accommodate the institutional memory and cultural values of older generations. Disputes that might have required formal legal processes in the old world are often resolved through sophisticated mediation techniques that emphasize restoration of community harmony while preserving individual dignity and collective effectiveness. These communities develop remarkably effective approaches to maintaining social cohesion while managing the inevitable tensions that arise when populations undergo rapid evolutionary change while facing existential survival challenges. The psychological challenges facing communities that survive into their 8th decade include not only the immediate stresses of extreme environmental conditions, but also the profound questions raised by witnessing human nature itself undergo transformation at rates that exceed anything documented in evolutionary history. Community members must process the reality that they may be participating in speciation events that could lead to the emergence of genuinely different forms of human existence, while maintaining cultural frameworks that preserve essential connections to human heritage and moral values. The relationship between preservation and innovation continues to evolve as communities discover that their enhanced human capabilities may allow them to develop solutions to survival challenges that would have been impossible using traditional approaches alone. Some settlements focus on utilizing these capabilities to maintain and adapt existing technologies, while others embrace more radical approaches that develop entirely new forms of human-environment interaction based on their transformed biological and psychological capabilities. The communities that successfully navigate these challenges often develop characteristics that represent genuine advances in human social organization, creating forms of collective decision-making and resource management that surpass the efficiency and fairness of previous social systems while maintaining the cultural values and moral frameworks that define human civilization. These achievements suggest that extreme environmental pressure, rather than simply threatening human survival, may catalyze the development of enhanced human capabilities that could prove valuable even if environmental conditions eventually improve. The few scientific investigators who can spare time from immediate survival concerns begin to document changes in human biology, psychology, and social organization that have no precedent in research literature. Their observations, recorded under primitive conditions with improvised equipment, suggest that human populations may be capable of adaptive responses to environmental pressure that operate far more rapidly and comprehensively than previously understood evolutionary mechanisms would predict. These findings, when they can be preserved and transmitted between communities, begin to form the foundation for new understandings of human potential that may prove beyond the immediate survival relevant far context. The question of whether these adaptive changes represent temporary responses to extreme conditions or permanent evolutionary developments that will define human existence for millennia becomes increasingly urgent as communities plan for futures that may extend far beyond their current survival challenges. The isolation between settlements means that different populations may be exploring divergent evolutionary paths that could eventually lead to the emergence of distinct human subspecies, each adapted to different survival strategies and environmental conditions. The long-term implications of these developments remain fundamentally uncertain, as communities cannot predict whether their adaptive experiments will prove successful over timescales that extend beyond immediate survival concerns. The balance between maintaining essential human characteristics and embracing changes that enhance survival capabilities continues to define every aspect of life within these communities, creating tensions that must be resolved through careful consideration of both immediate needs and long-term consequences for human development. The scattered settlements that persist into their 9th decade represent the most successful experiments in human adaptation ever attempted, each exploring different approaches to questions that have no precedent in human history. Their continued survival depends not only on their ability to maintain biological viability under extreme conditions, but also on their capacity to preserve something recognizably human, while embracing changes that push the boundaries of what human existence can encompass. The communities that achieve this balance may represent the seeds from which future forms of human civilization will grow, carrying forward essential elements of human culture and consciousness, while pioneering new possibilities for what human life might become under conditions that challenge every assumption about the nature and potential of human existence. As the ice continues its patient advance and atmospheric conditions show no signs of natural reversal, these transformed communities face the reality that they are not preserving the old world, but creating something entirely new. Their success represents humanity's greatest triumph of adaptation, demonstrating that human consciousness and culture can persist and even flourish under conditions that would have seemed incompatible with human survival. Yet their achievements also raise profound questions about the future of human identity, as the characteristics that enable survival under extreme conditions may eventually transform human nature so fundamentally that future generations will represent something genuinely different from the species that once built cities and reached for the stars. In the deepening silence of endless winter, where the familiar sounds of human civilization have been replaced by the subtle music of wind across ice and the careful whispers of communities that have learned to thrive in conditions their ancestors could never have imagined, the question of human survival transforms into something far more profound than mere biological persistence. These communities carry forward the essential spark of human consciousness while discovering new forms of existence that may prove more resilient and adaptable than the civilization they replace. Their struggle continues, not because they can guarantee success, but because something within human nature refuses to accept extinction, even when survival requires transformation so complete that it redefines what it means to be human in a world that has fundamentally changed the rules of existence itself. The emergence of something unprecedented begins to crystallize as the 10th decade arrives, like a whisper across the frozen wasteland. These communities, these fragments of humanity that have endured where cities once stood, start to exhibit characteristics that transcend mere survival. They begin to show signs of what can only be called Renaissance, though it bears no resemblance to any cultural flowering from human history. This is not a return to former glory, but the birth of something that has never existed before. The children who have known only ice develop capabilities that would seem supernatural to their great-grandparents. They navigate by reading the subtle variations in aurora patterns, understanding that certain configurations predict weather changes days in advance. Their ability to work in perfect coordination without spoken communication reaches levels that suggest forms of consciousness that operate beyond individual awareness. When they build, repair, or create, their hands move with precision that seems to bypass the learning process entirely, as if knowledge flows directly from observation to application without the intermediate steps that once defined human skill acquisition. These young survivors begin to develop what their elders hesitantly call the deep knowing, an intuitive understanding of their environment that encompasses not just immediate survival needs, but complex relationships between systems that would have required advanced scientific training to comprehend in the old world. They can predict the stability of ice formations by observing patterns invisible to older eyes, locate underground water sources through subtle changes in ground texture, and identify the nutritional content of unfamiliar plant materials through methods that seem to bypass conscious analysis entirely. Language within these communities continues its radical evolution, developing structures that accommodate forms of thought and communication that have no precedent in human linguistics. Conversations often occur through combinations of gesture, tone, and shared silence that convey complex information more efficiently than the elaborate verbal constructions of previous generations. The children speak in patterns that suggest their thinking operates through networks of association rather than linear logic, processing multiple variables simultaneously in ways that allow them to solve practical problems with remarkable speed and accuracy. The social structures that govern these communities begin to incorporate decision-making processes that operate through what can only be described as collective intuition. Groups facing complex choices often reach consensus through processes that bypass debate or formal discussion, arriving at solutions that prove remarkably effective despite the apparent absence of conscious deliberation. These communities develop governance systems that utilize the enhanced cooperative capabilities of their members, while maintaining the wisdom and institutional memory of older generations, creating hybrid structures that prove more effective than either traditional or revolutionary approaches alone. Medical practice within these settlements undergoes transformations that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between health and healing. Practitioners discover that their patients often recover from injuries and illnesses through processes that operate more rapidly and completely than anything documented in medical literature. The enhanced immune systems of these populations seem to incorporate adaptive responses that prevent many conditions from developing while accelerating recovery from others. Yet these biological improvements come with trade-offs that require entirely new approaches to healthcare, as traditional treatments prove unnecessary for some conditions while becoming essential for others that emerge from the unique stresses of their transformed existence. Tonight, we have walked through humanity's darkest winter, where the whisper of wind across endless ice replaced the hum of progress, and flickering flames became the last guardians of human consciousness. We have witnessed not merely the end of our technological marvel, but the profound transformation of what it means to be human when everything we believed permanent proves as fragile as frost on glass. In these scattered communities that learn to thrive in conditions their ancestors could never have imagined, we discover that survival demands more than mere endurance. It requires the courage to become something entirely new while preserving the essential spark that makes us recognizably human. The Ice Age may claim our cities and our certainties, but in the growing silence of endless tear, the question remains: what will emerge from the frozen ruins of everything we once knew?